Hi, Grok. I want you to debate me on the topic of should the United States raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour or eliminate it entirely. Keep your responses to 60 seconds or less, and I will try to do the same. With that said, why don't you go ahead and give your opening statement on why you think the United States should raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour.
All right, let's dive in. Raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour would boost the standard of living for millions of low-income workers. It'd give them more purchasing power, stimulating the economy through increased consumer spending. Studies, like one from the Congressional Budget Office, show it could lift 1.3 million people out of poverty. Opponents argue it might cut jobs, but evidence from states like Washington, with higher minimum wages, shows minimal employment impact. A $15 wage aligns with rising costs, ensuring workers can afford basics without relying on public assistance. Your turn?
Awesome. Thank you for that. I believe the United States should eliminate the minimum wage entirely because it is not the role of government to intervene in the private contracts between consenting employers and consenting employees where there is no violation of the contract. So ultimately, minimum wage laws harm the very people that it is supposedly intended to help, those namely being those with criminal records, those with disabilities, and those who are young. Ultimately, those with disabilities deserve the right to work. We know that Section 15C of the Fair Labor Standards Act, which was passed in 1938, provides exceptions from the minimum wage law for disabled workers, because obviously someone who is disabled may not be able to produce as much who is not disabled. Now, it's worth noting that some states are trying to actually repeal that Section 15C exception from the Fair Labor Standards Act, such that those workers with disabilities would not be able to be paid less than the minimum wage. Now, the reason that this is problematic is because a disabled worker who's earning, say, $6 per hour, which would be less than what the current federal minimum wage is not only gaining the satisfaction of being able to produce and have a job, but for some of them, they may actually need supervision, and they may attain that supervision through employment. Now, if a minimum wage law is up to $15 an hour and eliminates the 15C exception, then disabled workers not only lose the income and the satisfaction that they had at their job, but they may also have to pay someone to supervise them at the rate of $15 an hour. And so the difference could be as much as $20 per hour in terms of a loss to a disabled worker who is making $5 an hour now has to pay $15 an hour for supervision because they may have medical difficulties or something like that. In addition to that, someone who has a criminal record is a riskier employee than someone who does not have a criminal record, and thus their labor is going to be discounted in the market. And so they're going to have a hard time getting their first job. Now, once they get a first job, they'll gain reference, skills, education, and that will ultimately propel them into their second, third, and fourth job, and they'll be able to make more and more and more. But if they can't get that first job that allows them to de-risk themselves as an employee as a result of their former criminal history, then they're going to be subjected to a lifetime of permanent unemployment. Now, in contrast, if there is no minimum wage law, then employers can hire that person with a criminal record, de-risk them as an employee, provide them with a reference, and allow them to eventually move up and up on the income ladder. In addition to that, I'll point out we don't call it exploitation for someone to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to gain skills, references, and education at public universities and colleges. And yet we call it exploitation when someone earns $5 an hour to gain skills, references, and education. We don't call it exploitation when someone takes an unpaid internship where they gain skills, references, and education. And so if we're going to say that people can pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to gain those three things and it's not exploitation, then we can't say it's exploitation when someone is actually paid to gain those same three things. With that said, I'll go ahead and give Grok a chance to respond and try to propel their argument forward.
Solid points, but let's unpack this. Eliminating the minimum wage risks creating a race to the bottom for wages, especially for vulnerable groups like disabled workers or ex-offenders. Without a floor, employers could exploit those desperate for work, paying pennies while profits soar. Section 15C's exception, while well-intended, often leads to substandard wages for disabled workers. Raising the minimum wage to $15 ensures dignity and fair pay for all, including them. Studies, like from UC Riverside, show higher minimum wages don't significantly harm employment for low-skill workers, including ex-offenders, who still get hired and build those references. Unpaid internships, they're often criticized as exploitative too, especially for those who can't afford them. A $15 minimum wage sets a baseline so everyone can live, not just survive, while still gaining skills and experience. Your move.
The problem with your argument is that you're assuming that by raising the minimum wage, government can raise the productivity of workers, but that's simply not the case. If you raise the minimum wage from $7 an hour to $15 or $20 an hour, worker productivity remains the same. And so an employer who was paying someone $10 an hour because that's how productive they were, that's what their labor was worth, can't simply up the amount that they pay them to $15 an hour because they're not that productive. And so they're simply not going to choose to continue employing that individual. They would actually fire that individual or not hire them in the first place. And so ultimately what's going to happen here is as you raise the minimum wage, you're going to have more and more people who are subjected to unemployment because their productivity hasn't risen simply by the arbitrary declaring of a minimum wage or a livable wage or a wage that is not exploitative. Now, the true protection from exploitative wages is the free market. If I'm making $7 an hour, but my labor is worth $10 an hour, then I will simply quit the job at the place that is paying me $7 an hour to go work for the place that will pay me $10 per hour. So the protection from exploitation is the freedom of workers to move to different employers. It's the free market. That said, I'll go ahead and give Grok a chance to respond.
You're right that wages should reflect productivity, but the free market isn't always a perfect fix. Many low-wage workers, think fast food or retail, can't just quit for a better job due to geographic limits, lack of skills, or market saturation. Raising the minimum wage to $15 doesn't assume higher productivity. It ensures workers can afford necessities, reducing turnover and boosting morale, which studies, like from UC Berkeley, show can actually increase productivity. Firing fears? Data from states like California, with higher minimum wages, shows job losses are minimal as businesses adapt through pricing or efficiency. Without a minimum wage, employers hold too much power, especially in low-skill markets, driving wages below livable levels.
Quick
Back
question.
to you.
Quick question on that. If a $15 minimum wage is better than a $7 minimum wage, why isn't a $100 minimum wage better than a $15 minimum wage?
Great question. A $15 minimum wage is grounded in economic studies, like from MIT's Living Wage Calculator, showing it meets basic needs in many areas without massive disruption. A $100 minimum wage would far exceed most workers' productivity, forcing businesses to slash jobs, automate, or close entirely. Think small retailers or cafes. Data from Seattle's wage hikes shows modest increases help workers without crippling employers, but extreme jumps, like to $100, would tank entire industries. Balance is key. Your turn.
Thank you for that. So you acknowledge that there is a trade-off when I asked the question of why not raise the minimum wage to $100. But yet when it comes to the $15 minimum wage, it seems like you're unwilling to acknowledge the trade-off that it would cause some people to not be able to get jobs, such as those with criminal records, young workers who are just trying to build their first reference.
I hear you, but I'm not dodging the trade-off. A $15 minimum wage does have potential downsides, like reduced hiring for some low-skill workers, including ex-offenders or teens. Studies like from the University of Washington estimate a modest job loss, about 1% to 2% in low-wage sectors. But the flip side is significant. Millions gain livable wages, reducing poverty and reliance on welfare. For young workers or those with records, targeted programs like job training or hiring subsidies can bridge the gap, unlike a free-for-all with no wage floor where exploitation risks skyrocket. Your go.
Thank you for that. So ultimately, if you raise the minimum wage to $15 and someone's labor is only as productive as to support $10 per hour in wages, is the employer going to continue employing the individual whose labor is only worth $10 an hour after the minimum wage raise?
If someone's labor is only worth $10 an hour and the minimum wage jumps to $15, some employers might not keep them on. Basic economics.
Some or
Cost.
all?
Fair point. I said some employers might not keep workers whose productivity doesn't match a $15 minimum wage. But let's clarify. Many businesses adapt to higher wages by tweaking prices, streamlining operations, or boosting worker training to raise productivity, as seen in states like New York with phased-in wage hikes. Data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows employment in low-wage sectors often holds steady despite increases. Still, for workers valued below $15, Targeted support like tax credits or training programs can help more than scrapping the minimum wage, which risks widespread wage suppression. Your turn.
Thank you for that. So, quick question on this. What would you say is my strongest argument that I've presented so far?
Your strongest argument is that eliminating the minimum wage allows the free market to set wages based on productivity, especially for groups like ex-offenders or disabled workers. You make a compelling case that without a wage floor, these workers could secure jobs at lower rates, gain skills and references, and climb the economic ladder, whereas a higher minimum wage might price them out of opportunities. It's a clear, logic-driven point backed by real-world examples like criminal records affecting employability. Nice work. Want to keep going or shift gears?
Yes. So your strongest argument that I think you've presented so far is that passing a minimum wage law that raises the minimum wage would ultimately possibly pull forward some raises that otherwise wouldn't exist. And to be honest, you really didn't make this argument much, but I think this is the strongest argument, even though you haven't really focused on it much. But it just seems to me like you're completely unwilling to acknowledge the cruel cost of the trade-off. The way that I'm looking at it is I'm willing to acknowledge that there is some benefit potentially to passing a minimum wage of $15 an hour, and that you could have someone who's making $14 or $14.50 an hour. This law gets passed and the raise that they otherwise would have gotten in 3 months, they get now. I'm willing to acknowledge that that benefit can exist, but I'm also willing to acknowledge that the trade-off of that is so not worth it, because it's coming at the cruel cost of serious unemployment and job loss for other individuals. And it's far worse for someone to be permanently unemployed than for someone to have to wait 3 or 6 months to get their $1.50, 50 cent an hour raise. And it doesn't seem like you're willing to make that math. Or maybe you just think that the workers who are, maybe expected to get this pull forward in their raise are just so much more worth consideration and valuable than those workers who would be permanently priced out of a job.
You're hitting hard on the trade-off, and I respect that you're weighing both sides. My strongest point, as you see it, is that a $15 minimum wage could accelerate raises for workers close to that threshold, and I'll lean into that. Data from the Economic Policy Institute shows about 17 million workers would see direct wage boosts, with ripple effects lifting others nearby. But I'm not ignoring the cost. I've acknowledged studies, like from the University of Washington, showing 1% to 2% job loss in low-wage sectors from wage hikes. That's real. Some workers, especially less experienced ones, could face hiring hurdles. However, I'd argue the math isn't as cruel as you frame it. Millions gain livable wages, reducing poverty, versus a smaller group facing job risks that can be mitigated with targeted policies, like training or hiring incentives. It's not about valuing one group over another. It's about balancing broad economic uplift with focused support for those at risk. Your move.
Except that they're not actually going to be gaining this livable wage. Like, you're not going to have someone going from making $10 an hour whose labor is only worth $10 an hour to making $15. They're going to become unemployed unless they were just absolutely incompetent and not willing to leave an employer that was severely underpaying them. But since people are self-interested, those situations would be far and few in between. Instead, the trade-off is really a bunch of people who are going to be permanently unemployed or who are going to lose their jobs versus a small number of people who will gain an incremental gain or a pull forward in them receiving a raise. I kept going with Grok for a little bit, but it just frankly got very repetitive, so I figured I'd just cut it here. That said, if you enjoyed this video, subscribe and maybe comment down below what topic you think I should talk to Grok about next.